Welcome to the Marine Enthusiast Podcast, a podcast about marine biology and all things ocean. I'm your host for today, Guinevere, and today we are rather fortunate to be joined by Invasive Species Ecologist, Marine Parasitologist, and Marine Invertebrate Zoologist Dr. Jeb Byers. Jeb, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Glad you could join us.
So thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today. If you don't mind, I'd like to dive right into the questions.
Absolutely.
Yes. So what sparked your passion for the ocean and marine science at large?
Growing up, I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, and I spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking in the mountains. So I just have always had a general love of nature, being outside, being active. When I got to my formal undergraduate education at Duke University, I was a biology major. And in my junior year, I had the opportunity to study at the Duke Marine Lab down on the coast of North Carolina. And that's when I really kind of harnessed my biological interest more into the marine realm. And I got my feet wet, literally and figuratively, doing my first independent research study and learning all about critters. And that's when it really got traction and took a marine direction, my interest in biology.
That's wonderful. So you've always had a sort of a love of the natural world.
Yes. Yeah.
That's amazing. So I know that you mentioned, growing up in the mountains. I imagine that's very transformative to your understanding of, the world. Apart from that, was there any major person, place, book, or a media franchise that interested you in pursuing the biological sciences?
Well, one of my inspirations when I got to the Duke Marine Lab, I had a professor there, Dr. William Kirby Smith, and he taught invertebrate zoology. And that class was really instrumental in igniting my curiosity and passion. We had this habit of going out and collecting organisms from the field that we would later look at. But in the meantime, before we got to them, we would keep them in aquaria with our lab partner. So every two people had their own aquaria inside the lab. And I remember initially thinking, that's going to be a disaster. But I think in hindsight, that was exactly the point. Because he said, if you ever get bored with me talking, just watch the critters in your tank. And you can learn a lot from their behavior and physiology. And so that class was really captivating. And I really, as a result, just really poured myself into that class and got a ton out of it. And really fun, really learned a lot. And he was a really inspirational teacher.
That's incredible. Wow, that is one way to keep your students' interests.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of professors think that, lectures are the main way that you can get through to students, but there are lots of different ways that you can capture their interests.
Yes.
Yes. So I know that you mentioned invertebrates. I think that this next question is very telling about a person. It's one of my favorite to ask. What is your favorite terrestrial or marine animal personally, and what is your favorite marine or terrestrial animal that you have personally worked on?
Oh, well, octopus is definitely my favorite. There's so much I could say. I have a whole lecture that I give on octopus because I think it's a very special organism, both evolutionarily and what it can do. It has a intelligence that's sort of otherworldly because it's evolved on a completely different branch of life from humans. So all of its capabilities, like its intelligence, its eyes, everything, completely independently evolved, and capability of problem solving, just fascinating organism. I was fortunate enough actually to work on a project that involved octopuses in Australia because they're a major clam predator. And so we were doing a project on clams, and the octopus in the area were hunting the clams quite effectively and using the shells to fortify their dens.
Oh my!
So that made them kind of easy to spot. So we would dive and we'd swim around and we could map out all the octopus dens in our study area and quantify them. We did a lot of video analysis of them coming in and hunting for clams under the surface. So that was really fun because it sort of combined my personal interest in octopus from an actual academic study that we were doing.
That's incredible. Wow. And so this was a study that you did on the coast of Australia, West Coast or South Coast?
Yeah, it was in southeastern Australia, south of Sydney, a place called Lake Conjola, saltwater embayment. And I worked down there for a year during a sabbatical that I had back in 2007 and 2008.
That's simple. Wow.
Yeah.
So I know that you mentioned you attended Duke University for your undergraduate degree. What university did you attend for your PhD, and was there any specific reason that you chose that institution?
Yeah. So after undergrad, I took a couple years off to pursue some other interests. I taught high school in Latin America, in Ecuador for a year, and then I came back and I worked at the UNC, University of North Carolina Marine Lab for a year. And it was during that year that I really decided that that was what I wanted to do for myself. And also I learned a ton just from working with the other graduate students and professors there. And they were helpful because at that time I was applying for grad school, and they had a lot of recommendations on people and places to look into. And I knew that I wanted to study on the U.S. West Coast because I'd already studied a lot on the East Coast, and I wanted that geographic diversity. And they recommended some good people and places, and I ended up at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which is where I did my PhD. I did most of my field work actually in Northern California, in Marin County, which is north of San Francisco Bay, working on a species invasion. But my home institution was UC Santa Barbara.
That's wonderful. So what was the first research project that you led? I know that you've done lots and lots of research over the course of your career. And what was the first research project that you participated in any capacity?
Well, when I did my undergraduate semester, my junior fall at Duke University, I did an independent study project, which was one of the courses we could do for credit. And Dr. William Kirby-Smith, who I mentioned before, who was my animal diversity teacher, he was also my advisor on that project. Another reason he was really seminal in my development. And I did, in concert with him, we came up with a project idea where I was going to look at heavy metal contamination and compare it between a filter feeder oyster and a deposit feeder, a mud snail. And I was going to compare it between open water and marina environments. So it was a pretty straightforward design, but it was a good bite-sized project for an undergraduate. And I pretty much did that independently once I learned sort of the proper methodology to use. And so that was my first project. And after I graduated, I ended up getting that paper published in a peer-reviewed journal, which was a pretty important step at that time, especially because I was considering grad school, and also the way I sort of cut my teeth in marine ecology research.
That's incredible. So do you remember which journal it got published in? I'm sure that...
it's called the Journal of the Eliza Mitchell Society. And that journal is a small journal. It's primarily focused on research that happens in North Carolina. And that's where I had done the work at the Duke Lab. And that was an appropriate journal. It's not a top tier journal, so that was, an easier entry point for me as an undergraduate getting a paper published there. It was a great experience.
That's wonderful. I've never heard of them before. I'll definitely look into that now. So, what work have you done in the field of marine parasitology and in relation to marine diseases? I know that's a very hot topic now, considering the way that climate stressors are affecting everything.
Yeah, I first got interested in marine parasites, so I was working for my PhD on a species invasion, and there was an invasive mud snail from Japan that had entered into the United States and was outcompeting, or at least that's what I was addressing, how and if it was outcompeting a native mud snail. And I remember getting a question quite often in the early stages of my PhD preparation about, how are the parasites affecting the system? Because parasites are pretty synonymous with mud snails. They are heavily loaded. And it turns out I looked inside them, and there are a lot, and it sort of changed my perspective on the world after seeing that, because you can't unsee that whole hidden world inside these organisms once you look there. And so it became sort of a fascinating angle for a lot of my projects after that, and the focal point for research, looking at the ecology of parasites. So not so much necessarily how they affect the host, which is what medicine and traditional parasitology is interested in. This is more like how they affect populations and how the parasites themselves are influenced by environmental factors, for example. And so a lot of my work since my PhD has taken that on as an important research perspective. And we've done a lot of work looking at parasites from biogeographic perspectives, like how they're spread over large spatial scales and what factors control their distributions. I just finished co-editing a book called The Ecology and Evolution of Marine Parasites and Disease, which has a whole bunch of different perspectives, including evolutionary patterns that parasites demonstrate and are used to showcase because of their short generation times, and looking at large spatial and temporal scale patterns in parasites, environmental drivers of their abundance, that sort of thing. So it's been a long-term research focus for myself and my students.
That's extraordinary. And where will this book be published? Where will it be available?
It just came out this spring by Oxford University Press.
Oh my God! Oh, that is an amazing cover.
I just got some copies from the publisher. So it's out from Oxford University Press, Ecology and Evolution of Marine Parasites and Disease. And we have a lot of really top-level marine parasitologists in the field who contributed to the book, and so it's really nice to see that compilation come together.
That's incredible. And there are not, many books on this subject. It's sort of an unconventional, or it's a very interesting niche within the world of marine science at large.
Yeah, I think it's always been there somewhat, especially because of the intersection of disease and fisheries. And in fact, the fisheries world is where we have some of the best data. And some of the empirical work that we've done in this system lately has been in those systems because there's a lot of interest and money to solve a lot of these disease problems. So more recently, we've worked, for example, with oysters and shrimp and crabs because of their high economic value. There's a lot of political interest in getting these disease issues solved. But from an ecology perspective, those are also very rich data sources, so we can tap into those to learn we have good big data sets we can use to ask questions in systems like that. So it's kind of a nice two-way street of solving problems, but also having lots of data to throw at questions and problems that we've got to solve.
That's incredible. And you're right. I mean, a lot of people don't really think of fisheries beyond its economic value, but it does provide a lot of real valuable ecologic data.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that you mentioned you started working on species invasions during your PhD. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know how you use this information to create conservation strategies tailored to reducing them, and also what you learned about the sort of ecology of invasive species and how they affect local ecosystems.
So when I started grad school, I was interested in working on invasive species. It was kind of a rising topic at the time. And then late 1980s is when the zebra mussel first showed up in the U.S., and that's sort of the poster child for invasion biology. And I was entering grad school in the mid-90s, and so it was just kind of taking form that this is something that should be looked at, from a more formal perspective. Rather than just sort of ad hoc, one-off, here's a problem species. And so there was a big desire to figure out, can we predict which species are going to be problematic? What do we do when we find out that they are? And so a lot of my work my PhD work was actually looking at quantifying species invasion, like trying to figure out if we can figure out mechanistically what's going on, trying to gain insight by accruing examples like that. The field has become much more sophisticated over the last few decades. It's much more quantitative now. Policy-wise, we've gotten more sophisticated too, because now we're not just letting in species willy-nilly anymore. We're putting the onus on people to show that a species is safe before you bring it in. There are inspections from government agencies like APHIS, especially in our ports, that look at and possibly condemning or turning back shipments that are contaminated with invasive species. But we're still way behind the curve because the species are being introduced at exponentially high rates. And so, they're with us. And so figuring out how these species integrate into native food webs and systems is a way we can sort of create lemonade out of the situation, because it's a way to study ecological and evolutionary questions with novel species interactions. species that don't share any evolutionary history are coming together, but seeing how they interact can be informative.
That's a beautiful way of looking at things, sort of making lemonade out of the situation. That's true. I mean, I haven't thought of parasites as lemons. I sort of think of them as evil vermin to be exterminated with great vigor. But that is a much more productive way of looking at things.
Yeah.
One of the invasive species, which is making sort of a name for itself, at least in the U.S. right now, screwworm. Have you heard of any information on that? Do you have any colleagues working on that situation?
I don't have any colleagues directly working on it. That's an interesting case study because the U.S. had been very instrumental in controlling screwworm. I don't know how much you want me to get into the background of this system, but that's a system that had started in South America and had been spreading into Central America and was reaching the southern border of the U.S. This is back, several decades ago. And the U.S. Figured out ways to control it. And basically, we were able to push back screwworm to the South American border so that it was absent from the Central American isthmus. And it was a great example of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yes.
Because we were spending just tiny amounts of money, and it was keeping the screwworm at bay. It's a very, very painful infection. It infects livestock, and it can actually be lethal if it's in high doses. But the program was dismantled by the U.S.
Yes.
I believe it happened fairly recently as part of the Doge government cutback efforts.
Yes.
Even though this program only costs pennies on the dollar.
Yes.
And now we're paying the price because screwworm has now resurged all through Central America and into the United States. I mean, it's just so short-sighted because it was super easy to control and very, very cheap. And now the cat's out of the bag again, and we've got to go back to square one and figure out how to control it again, and it's going to cost a ton of money. So it's a real shame, but again, it's an example of things we've seen from time to time of just how important it is to control these invasions as early on as possible.
That's very true. A lot of people think that, because a solution has been working for an extended period of time, that the problem has gone away. But that's not how things work. That's especially not how ecology works. Yeah.
There's a really good Radio Lab episode. I don't know if any of the listeners are familiar with that podcast, but from fairly recently, they did a nice recap of this whole system. And how the screwworm were a problem, how it got controlled, and how it's coming back. So I encourage people to look out for that podcast. Really helpful and really engaging.
That's very interesting. I appreciate you mentioning that, by the way. I'll look into that after this. I'm always, despite being a podcaster, I also look for other podcasts to listen to. So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And it's also driving all the beef prices up. We just had 4th of July, and we have a lot of cookouts and big celebrations for that. So that is, it is an ongoing situation.
I mean, controlling invasives is really hard, and so that was an example where we had one under control, and it was so much human hubris in throwing that control away, because that's one of the things you learn with invasions is it's much easier to control them and prevent them from being established, and once they're spread, it's very expensive and difficult to get them back under control again. So we're going to pay the price for that now going forward.
Yes, we most certainly are. So moving back to your career and your research focuses, what research have you done in relation to studying the effects of global climate change on marine ecosystems? I know I spoke about this a little bit at the beginning of the episode.
Well, I've tackled that from a few angles. I've done some reviews on how temperature might affect parasites and disease in marine systems. We've also been in some of the empirical work we've done, for example, on shrimp disease. Temperature was a major driver of some of the disease outbreak. but some of the work we've been doing is sort of on a more global biogeographic scale, where we look at how temperature might affect range boundaries. But I think one important note for the listeners is that in the ocean, temperature might not be the most important factor changing with climate, and rather the currents that might be changing in conjunction with all the climate changes going on. Because a lot of times in terrestrial systems, organisms are able to track changes in temperature. For example, if it's getting hotter, they'll move farther north or farther up in elevation. But in the ocean, organisms don't necessarily have that luxury of being able to track that, because they get bounded by, for example, biogeographic breaks, which prevent their movement, because they have to, in some ways, only go where the currents can take them. And a lot of times the currents might not be conducive to taking them to the place they need to get the right temperature. And so that's an important facet to keep in mind when you're thinking about how marine organisms respond to global change, is it's not necessarily always going to be due to temperature like it often is in terrestrial systems.
That's very true. A lot of people don't realize the effects of also salinity change. That's a major one,
Right.
especially as you go closer to Greenland with the ice sheet melting and the fresh water being introduced. Yes. That and also pH. A lot of people don't understand or realize that ocean acidification is occurring. That's a big one.
Correct, yeah.
Yes. So I know that you mentioned that you grew up in North Carolinas, and the Carolinas are fairly famous for their marshlands. What work have you done in relation to estuarine ecology?
Yeah, a huge part of my work is in estuaries. Those habitats are near shore, so they're very accessible. They're also on the front line of any human impacts, because they're the part that's interfacing between humans and the shoreline. And they're really fun. And here on the East Coast, they're really extensive. The marshes here in Georgia will go on and on and on for miles. You get lost in one of them. So it's a giant habitat. It's really fascinating. I just know the ecology of it well, and so it's a fun system to keep exploring in more detail. The farther offshore you go in marine ecology, marine biology, the more expensive it is. You need ship time and boat time, but you can put on a pair of boots and walk out into the estuary anytime you like. So it's very accessible, and so therefore it tends to be easier to study.
That's wonderful. And have you done any interesting research projects related to estuarine ecology or organisms found in estuarine ecosystems?
Yeah, almost all the organisms I work with are estuarine. So everything from the snails that I did my PhD on, we've been working a lot with oysters and shrimp and crabs. Some of those species do occasionally live offshore, but at least part of their life cycle, like the shrimp, is in nearshore estuaries. And so we can work with them in those accessible areas.
That's wonderful. Yes, and a lot of people don't realize how vital marshlands and estuaries are as nurseries, and how if you look at life stage ecology, they are so incredibly important. Because same thing goes for mangroves. It's not usually associated with shrimp necessarily, but the point still stands.
Right.
Yes, a lot of people think that just because an organism spends most of its life in one area, that, conserving marshlands or mangroves, estuaries isn't important. That's not true. That's not how it works.
Right.
Yes, precisely. So I know that you mentioned that you've worked with mud snails, but I'm curious to know, what work have you done in marine invertebrate zoology? I know that you mentioned mud snails and octopuses, but
yeah,
it's a very big field.
Almost all the organisms I work with are inverts. Occasionally we'll do a project which dips into the fish world, but lots of shellfish, oysters, mussels, clams, snails, shrimp and crabs. So crustacean and mollusks are certainly the biggest group that I've worked with. But like I said, sometimes fish are involved, sometimes seaweeds are involved, but invertebrates seems to be where my passion is.
That's wonderful, and I agree. A lot of people think that invertebrates, because they might have slightly less complex physiology, they are uninteresting, or that they are not ecologically important. And of course, we know that's not true. They are incredible organisms, and as you mentioned, octopuses are some of the most intelligent species out there, and a lot of people discount that because they lack bones.
Yeah, in the southeastern U.S. All the important commercial fisheries are invertebrates. So in Georgia, for example, we have no commercial fin fishery. And I think that often surprises people because you hear the word fishery and you just assume you're talking about fin fish. But here, shrimp and then crab and oyster are the top three species, all inverts. Part of that is because of our turbid water. It's not very conducive for having as large enough fish populations to sustain a commercial fishery per se. So invertebrates have big economic heft too. I mean, think of the American lobster industry, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard that lobsters are valued at something like $7 billion globally, the fisheries for lobster. And that is incredible.
It's way up there. Yeah.
Yes. And a shrimp, as we both know, are important globally as a food source. So a lot of people discount their economic value.
Yeah.
Yes. So, part of your career has been spent researching anthropogenic impacts on the ocean, primarily through pollution. So, what research have you done in this regard, and what are some of the conclusions that you've come to?
So lots of research. We've done a lot of research in the area of anthropogenic impacts. Invasive species themselves that we've already been talking about a lot are anthropogenically spread, or they're aided in their transport around the world. That's why they've become such a problem, is the rate of introduction has gone up so high. We've worked a little bit with microplastics and their accumulation in oysters. Let's see, I'm trying to think. Those are the two that come most to mind. We've done some projects on what we call shoreline armoring, which is when people put up structures to protect their property from erosion or beachfront energy, and looking at what those effects are in different marine and estuarine environments. So those are some of that's sort of a good flavor of the ways we looked at anthropogenic problems.
That's incredible. And, a lot of people think that because of the way that the shoreline is constructed, it's going to stay that way permanently, but that's not how things are working. We're seeing lots of erosion in Florida and California especially, which are two states known for their beachfront properties. So the effects of that, at least on human infrastructure, I think, are starting to be seen now, but they're going to become ever more prominent in the next 20 to 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And oysters you mentioned, and microplastics accumulation in relation to them. I'd imagine that they'd be particularly vulnerable to bioaccumulation in relation to plastics, considering, the fact that they strain the water column and in addition to getting the microorganisms from the water column to sustain themselves, they also strain out pollutants.
Exactly. It all depends on where they are. We found that urban estuaries obviously have a much higher problem with that than rural ones. But yeah, you're right. The filter feeders are on the front line of that.
Yes, very much so. Oh, and one more question. In your mind, due to the way that invasive species are transported as a result of human shipping or transport, do you think that they are a form of pollution?
Well, I do find that useful sometimes in talking to people to refer to them as biological pollution. Because if you have a ship filled with ballast water, when ships are traveling in the ocean, they often use ballast water to help them stabilize. And oftentimes that ballast water could be sucked up from a port in the originating city. So for example, say you have a ship that's in Vietnam and it takes in ballast water and then it transits the Pacific and it gets to San Francisco Bay and decides it doesn't need that ballast water anymore, and it dumps it out in the bay. And that went on for decades all around the world. People started realizing, well, that water that you are dumping in the bay is not sterile. It has all kinds of living organisms in it, larvae and even sometimes small fish. And a lot of those organisms are taking root in the bay. In fact, San Francisco Bay now has more than 300 non-native species, in part due to that ballast water transfer over the decades. And so getting people to realize that water needs to be treated like you might treat sewage water, or you might treat something, has now been changed. We now have new policies on how that ballast water can be dealt with, and there's still people working on new ways to do it more effectively. But yeah, I think framing invaders as biological pollution can be very useful. Now, of course, there are non-native species that we eat, use in agriculture, and that we have as pets and things. So you can't always frame them that way, but I do think it can be useful when you talk about the problem generally to help people understand.
It's a very good point. Yes. And wow, yes, San Francisco, as you know, is a major shipping port. So I suppose I never thought about the ecological effects of all of those ships coming in through the decades, and that I imagine has taken quite the toll on the bay.
Most of the biomass in San Francisco Bay is not native at this point. Somewhere between 90 and 95% of the bay is non-native, and I think that number shocks people. But that's the result of lots of carelessness and dumping in ballast water from other places, and people dumping in exotic pets that they don't want anymore, and lots of different reasons. Every story, every species has a different background, different backstory. But I often tout San Francisco Bay as being the most invaded estuary in the world, but it's probably just the one we have the best data on. It's been very well studied, and so we've been able to document those changes over time.
That's very true. And, people dumping exotic pets they no longer have the ability to care for. That's how one of the most notable species invasions happened with lionfish off the coast of Florida, and also boas in the Florida Everglades.
Yeah, lionfish are partly from that, and partly they think they escaped from aquaria during hurricanes.
Oh, really?
But yeah, another example that's there in California is the Chinese mitten crab. It was thought that species was being imported maybe for food in some of the Asian communities in the Bay Area, and someone at one point thought they could get their own local population started, and that one's problematic. That species actually harbors human lung fluke, and so that's raised a lot of concern because that species is now established in the bay.
That is very concerning. And lung flukes, those are very disgusting little creatures.
Yeah.
Yes, as I mentioned, I do not tolerate parasites in humans or in animals. I have very strong feelings about them.
Yeah.
Yes. So we spent a lot of time talking about pollution and about species invasions. What are ecosystem engineers, and how would you describe them to those unfamiliar? That's a term that I hear referenced a lot in relation to your work.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work in the area of ecosystem engineers. Sometimes these are referred to also as foundation species. There's a recognition that certain species are very structurally important in the habitats they live in. And you can't think of the habitat existing without them. In fact, sometimes we even use the species when we're talking. So we talk about coral reef communities, for example, or oyster reef communities, or we talk about hemlock forests. You're actually invoking, in that case, the name of an ecosystem engineer, because that species is a linchpin for the entire system. So in the case of the coral are making their calcium carbonate skeletons, which is important habitat for other species. It changes the flow of the environment, it changes the erosion rates, it's habitat. So it's engineering the environment, it's changing the physical environment for a lot of different organisms. So that term is a broad term used to capture that effect. It can be, the examples I gave were the organism itself creating the structure, like a coral or an oyster or a tree, but you can also have examples where organisms build structures outside of their bodies, like termites build a mound or beavers build a dam. And that's also another form of engineering that, again, in this case, actually persists outside of the engineer itself and can live in the environment for a long time, even after the engineer is gone. So studying these, we've oftentimes, ecologists have known that this effect has existed for a long time, but we haven't really formalized the study of it, until the last several decades, realizing that the dam that a beaver creates, its engineering, is probably more important than its biological effects of what it eats and how it competes.
Yes.
That dam has a huge influence on the biogeochemistry and all the other organism interactions and affecting a very large spatial scale. And so recognizing that the engineering might be the most important thing the species is doing has been a fun aspect for me to consider in some of the research that I'm doing.
That's brilliant. And that leads very nice into my next question. What are you currently working on at the University of Georgia?
Well, I have several graduate students, and they're always actively in the field pursuing different topics. I have one who's working on ecosystem engineering, and in particular, we have ecosystem engineers in mangroves. They're a very important engineer because they are a woody tree. It's one of the only trees that can live in salt water, and it performs a lot of engineering through erosion control, slowing waves, and also providing habitat. And it is spreading northward with climate change. It's been limited by freezing temperatures in the winter, and as those have been becoming more moderate, it's spreading northward and is interacting and coming in contact now with salt marsh grass called Spartina, which is another ecosystem engineer. And in the marshes of Georgia, for example, that's the dominant plant species that lives in lower marsh areas because it can tolerate the salt very well. And so she's looking at what happens when the mangroves and the Spartina come in interaction. You have two engineers that are both very important to their respective environments, and now they're coming in contact with one another. So what happens both in the transition phase and what happens in the long run is an important question to understand. I have another student working on parasite ecology, looking at how contaminants affect parasite communities, and another student who has been looking at biogeographic boundaries and how they're influenced by currents. This is a topic we talked on earlier. So, lots of activity going on. We finished up some work recently looking at shrimp disease, black gill disease in shrimp, and we were particularly interested to know if that was affecting potentially the shrimp population. And we've been working a lot with oysters and oyster disease as well, and what factors are affecting the broad scale patterns in oyster disease.
That's incredible.
So that's a quick sampling of some of the things we got going on.
Yes, that's wonderful. And I imagine studying, shrimp disease is especially important down there in Georgia. As you mentioned, they are a major export fisheries-wise, and they are very important to the culinary scene in Georgia.
Yes. Yeah.
Indeed. So you have had a long and, if I do say so, illustrious career. What would you say has been your biggest triumph or proudest moment across your career?
Oh, gosh. Well, there's probably a lot of them. I mean, I think speaking generally, it's always a great moment when you have a student who graduates and moves on to the next step of their career. That's really satisfying. It's always a little bittersweet when a student leaves the lab, but it's nice to see them land on their feet and get a job that they've been really excited about and move on and spread their wings and start their own independent research careers. I've been proud I've been involved in 2 books, the one I showed you on parasites and another one on ecosystem engineering. And when those edited books came out, that was a pretty proud moment. Finishing big grant projects is always satisfying when you've had some important questions in front of you, and after several years, you've able to get some insight on some really important academic and also sometimes practical questions. The shrimp disease we worked on was really fulfilling in that regard because that's a very important commercial species, and we were able to show in this case that we don't think the black gill disease was having much of an effect on the shrimp populations. And so that was an important finding to understand from a practical sense in that system.
That's wonderful. Yes, and I imagine that it is very bittersweet watching your student leave a laboratory. That's one of the things that I hope to someday enter academia and become a professor, and I wonder how I'll deal with that. But it's always nice, I've heard, when a student comes back to you years later and says, hey, I'm in my PhD program now, or hey, I'm doing a postdoc at X, Y, and Z institution. Yes, indeed. So my next question focuses on something that I know a lot of people don't like to touch on, your challenges and your setbacks. So I'm sure that you have faced just as many challenges and setbacks as you have leaps forward. What has been the biggest hurdle or challenge across your career, and how did you overcome it?
That's a good question. Well, I think thankfully, since I've been a professor, I don't think I've had too many giant hurdles. Part of that is just once you get to that stage, you're able to roll with the punches a little bit better, and you understand how to get around problems. And you also have your many, many projects going forward. So if one of them gets stymied, you're able to pivot to some of the others that are flowing better. Well, I would say the hardest part is in the earlier stages when you're in your PhD and you have one major focus of research. And so if you hit a snag, then it can kind of derail things and you have to figure out your way around it. And relatedly, I think finding a postdoc, that's usually the stage that you do after your PhD, that can be quite difficult because those positions are very limiting. It's sort of the stage you do in between your PhD and a faculty job. And so finding a postdoc, especially one that you're excited about and want to do, can sometimes be a hurdle. But I was thankful in all those cases I was able to persevere and move through them. But I definitely, looking back on my career, those kind of hurdles are definitely more, you're just not as experienced dealing with them, and you're also more single-focused then too. So a problem sort of means that everything comes to a halt, and you have to work around it. Whereas now I've got more irons in the fire, and I can pivot around things better when problems arise.
That's wonderful, and I really respect your resilience and your sort of adaptability to things, and I admire your optimism in looking back at your career and thinking about all of this.
Yeah.
I think that optimism is very important, especially as a scientist, as you are. So what would you say is your advice for new marine scientists, early career ocean professionals, or young, passionate people looking to enter ocean conservation?
Well, I think you want to be ambitious and energetic and driven. I think look for opportunities to get involved. Those opportunities, by the way, may not always be marine. Like when I'm looking for graduate students, oftentimes what I want to see is commitment. Do they know the scientific method? Do they have research experience? And the exact theme of what they've been researching is probably a secondary interest to me. I mostly want to know, hey, do they persevere? Do they know how to stick to a problem? Have they worked in a lab for a number of years and gotten some continuity there? Because to me, like the scientific skills are the important part. The actual area that you apply them to, whether it's a certain species or a certain system, to me is kind of the icing on the cake. So yeah, being open to possibilities, maybe not even in the marine realm, as long as they further your interest in a thematic area or in science in general. Curiosity, questions, yeah.
That's wonderful. Now, that was very insightful. I appreciate you mentioning that. A lot of people think of research very narrowly, but I appreciate you thinking of it in sort of a broader method. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of today's interview. This has been wonderful. Do you have any final words about your work, the ocean, invasive species, or climate change?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think a lot of it has been encapsulated in our talk here today. I don't know that I necessarily have any concluding remarks other than, for me, it's been a really, really fun career. I like being a professor a lot because there's a lot of variety in the job, and I can teach, and I can do research, and I can help on service-oriented things, and even within those areas, I can pivot to teach different classes or do different research projects or work with different colleagues. So I really have enjoyed the variety. I really enjoy the curiosity and getting to solve problems. just thinking. That's one of my favorite times of the week is when we have lab meeting and we get to sit down and think about problems, and you hear other perspectives about how to approach a subject matter. And it's really fulfilling to me. So if that is appealing to you, it's a good field to pursue.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for taking the time to sit down with us today, Jeb. I really do appreciate it. And sadly, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed this lovely interview. If you enjoyed,
thank you, Guinevere. Yeah, that was very fun, and look forward to hearing the episode when it airs.
Yes, absolutely. We're hoping to get that done soon. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like and follow us for more exciting episodes such as these. With that being said, this has been the Marine Enthusiast Podcast. Goodbye, marine enthusiasts.